Hello, kiddos. Okay, so let's finish up our Stations of the Cross packet. I'm going to be doing a screen grab video for you all today, and I'm hoping that when I upload it, you'll be able to see all the notes that I'll be putting up on the side. But if not, I'll also be posting the slides for you. Now, while I'm presenting, I'm going to be giving you some biblical references to review. Please be sure to note down all of these verses as you follow along in the video. They're going to pop up on the screen for you to copy down easily. So our first station is Jesus is condemned to death. You can find a scripture reference to this in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 15, verses 1 through 15. Now, some quick commentary here to keep you focused on the connection to our life. Pontius Pilate does not want to send Jesus to be crucified because there's no justifiable reason. The pressure of the people and his desire to not be kicked out of office forces his hand, and so he allows for Jesus to die. I think it's important to note that Pilate had a choice. He could have said no to Jesus' crucifixion, but he didn't. The second station, Jesus takes up his cross. The scripture reference for this can be found in John chapter 19, verses 13 through 17. Let's just quickly mention that Jesus carries his own cross in the scripture. But you have to imagine that this cross needs to fit a fully grown man, so it must have been extremely heavy. And it's going to be the instrument of his death. So think of it like your grandmother or mom sending you to get a chancla so she can throw it at you. That's torture. The third station is Jesus falls the first time. Our scripture references are John chapter 1, verses 29, and Isaiah chapter 53, verses 4 through 7. This is one of the stations that doesn't have any historical or biblical evidence to support that it happened. But Isaiah uses this idea of a lamb being led to the slaughter to describe how the Son of Man will endure incredible pain in our place. The fourth station, Jesus meets his mother. Our scripture references are Lamentations 1, verse 12, Luke chapter 2, verses 25 through 40, and John chapter 19, verses 26 through 27. None of these scriptures confirm that Jesus actually met Mary as he walked to his death, but it does confirm that she was there to witness it. John chapter 19, verses 26 through 27 is the part of the crucifixion of Christ, where he tells John, his disciple, to take Mary as his mother and take care of her. And Luke chapter 2, verses 25 through 40 is about the prophet Simeon, who greets Mary as she brings Jesus in to be not baptized, but consecrated. And the prophet gives her a glimpse of her future about Jesus. And he says that a sword will pierce Mary's heart as well, her heart and soul too. This is a huge reason why I'm such a big fan of The Mary's Way of the Cross by Richard Furry. It walks the way of the cross through Mary's eyes, and I just think that it is so heartbreaking and beautiful because it tugs at your heart to hear how much pain Mary was also in. The fifth station, Simon of Cyrene carries the cross. The scripture references here are Mark chapter 15, verse 21, Mark chapter 8, verse 34, and 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 3. It's only Mark chapter 15, verse 21 that speaks of Simon of Cyrene. The other two scriptures I mention here speak of how a follower of Christ must take up their cross to follow Christ. Now, we know that there was a man named Simon who did help Jesus carry the cross because it's mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew as well. But we also know that Mark, who wrote the first Gospel, was using this example of Simeon, or of Simon, to prove his point back in Mark chapter 8, verse 34. And whether he kind of invented the character of Simon or not, Simon is the example of what it means to be a Christian and what a Christian needs to do. The sixth station is Veronica wipes the face of Jesus. The scripture we're going to look at for this station are Isaiah 53, verses 2 to 3, and Matthew chapter 25, verse 40. It's another station that has no historical or biblical reference, but the symbolism of the person of Veronica is living what Jesus had said before, that whatever you do to the least of these, you do unto him. The seventh station. Jesus falls the second time. Our scriptures here are Psalm chapter 38, verses 6 through 22, and Isaiah chapter 63, verse 9. So as you can see, they're both Old Testament writings. You'll see with all of the falls of Jesus, there's no biblical evidence that he did fall. But each station with the fall of Jesus is reflected and supported by the passages in the Old Testament that speak of someone that will come and feel the pain of the people and save them. The eighth station. Jesus meets the daughters of Jerusalem, or also known as Jesus consoles the women of Jerusalem. We find two passages that help us understand this station. Luke chapter 23, verses 27 to 31, which confirms that Jesus does meet women on his way to Calvary. And Matthew chapter 7, verse 21, reminds us of one of Jesus' teachings of how a heart attached to this world will never be able to reach heaven. The women who were weeping for Jesus were not weeping because they were truly sad for him. They were more like professional criers looking for attention. Jesus tells them to instead weep that they may be saved, because he knows that in their hearts they're attached to what the world has to offer. He wants them instead to truly want to follow him, to truly weep because they know that this is for their sins, that he has to endure this suffering. The ninth station. Jesus falls the third time. We look at Psalm chapter 37, verse 23 through 24, and Hebrews chapter 4, verses 15 and 16. In the book of Psalms, it speaks about how the Lord guides our steps and will never allow us to fall. While Jesus physically falls, he does not stumble on his journey to the fulfillment of his part in God's plan. In Hebrews chapter 4, we hear about the high priest, the one above us that also understands our pain. Remember that our faith has a hierarchy, but the one at the top, the king, the high priest, while he is above us in his power and his might and in his station, he does not remove himself from understanding our pains and weaknesses. The 10th station. Jesus is stripped of his garments. The Gospel of John highlights this humiliating scene. John chapter 19, verses 23 to 24. The Romans truly came up with an extreme form of capital punishment. Not only did the person die, but they're exposed for everyone to see. And in Jesus' case, according to John, they took his clothes and then gambled for them, gambled for which person could get which garment. John says that this gambling for his clothing is a fulfillment of Scripture, or prophecy, found in Psalm chapter 22, verse 16 through 18. The writer of Psalms, David, paints a scene of someone being surrounded by villains who pierced his hands and feet, and who exposed his body so that his bones are visible, and who then divide and gamble for his clothes. Now, there are no accidents or coincidences with God. David in the Old Testament was inspired to write this verse, and now John recognizes those similarities and uses them to prove the validity of Jesus' claim to be Son of God. The 11th station, Jesus is nailed to the cross. All the Gospels speak of Jesus' death, but we will focus on Luke chapter 23, verses 33 to 43, which gives a pretty good narrative about the crucifixion. Now, the thing about crucifixion is that it could last for days. Realistically, the person would end up dying due to a combination of blood loss, organ failure, and asphyxiation, which basically means choking to death. Like I said, the Romans had come up with an ultimate form of capital punishment. The 12th station. Jesus dies on the cross, or Jesus is crucified. The Gospel of John has one of the best accounts of Jesus' passion and death. John chapter 19, verses 28 through 37, is a narrative about his final moments, sprinkled with Old Testament passages to provide evidence that Jesus was the one the Jewish people had been waiting for. The Gospel writer of John was really good at this. he really proves Jesus' claim. Jewish readers would have been persuaded with this account because the scriptures John uses are familiar to them. They'd probably studied and memorized these verses as young people. So in this way, John is bringing people to the mission of Christ. The 13th station, Jesus is taken down from the cross. Again, we hear from John's Gospel, John chapter 19, verses 38 to 40. We learn that Jesus had secret disciples, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. While during his life they'd been afraid to follow Jesus in the light, they stepped up after his death and took great care to give Jesus a proper burial, even if it was a quick one. The 14th station, Jesus is laid in the tomb. Mark chapter 15, verses 46 through 47, and Matthew chapter 27, verses 57 through 61, confirm John's account of Joseph of Arimathea, going to ask Pilate to take down Jesus' body. Mark, which is the first gospel written, keeps the account short and sweet. Matthew, on the other hand, adds a few more details. But both accounts mention that Mary Magdalene and another Mary were there sitting outside the tomb where Jesus was laid to rest. All right, kiddos, that is all the time we have for these stations. Thank you for sticking with me this whole way. I hope you jotted down all these notes, and I will see you in the next video where we are going to address what you see on the right-hand side above the pictures.